Welcome to our Women Wednesday Entrepreneur Series. I'm Brandy Stitt, the Program Director for the Women's Business Center in Kansas City. Thank you all for joining us. This is the third session of our leadership that we've been in partnership with Lever One. Again, we will have Danielle Bearden joining us as our presenter for today. If you missed the first two sessions, emotional intelligence and interpersonal communications, we are posting those videos on our Women's Business Center YouTube channel, so you can find those there, and I will post that link in our chat. We're also recording today's webinar, and we'll also be posting that on our YouTube channel, so you can certainly revisit this session if you'd like to later on YouTube. So feel free, if you have questions for Danielle throughout the presentation, pop those either into the chat box or into the Q&A, and we will monitor those throughout the session. So that's really the best way to communicate with Danielle if you do have questions. So at this time, we are going to focus on vulnerability in leadership, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Danielle.
Thank you again for having us. These are one of the most rewarding series that we give. And this very last one, I'll go ahead and ask Michelle to start sharing the screen. This very last one on vulnerability in leadership is super close to my heart as a leader. Whereas on the other sessions that we had in emotional intelligence and interpersonal communications in the workplace, those topics are more apt to be able to practice and perfect in a short amount of time. This one, and why I have it last, is because it isn't. The vulnerability in leadership is something that's going to take some time. And I like to start, before I even touch on this topic, to say that it takes a very open mind as a manager and as a leader to adopt this concept. And so for those of you who may not be quite there yet as we go through, just know that this is not something, comparatively speaking to the other two sessions, that is easily learned. This will take quite some time. And Michelle, if you could do me a favor, when you share this, can you also enable the audio? So you may have to exit out, Michelle, and then reshare, but enable the audio if you know how to do that. Otherwise, I certainly can.
Yes, I have already done that. So hopefully it all works well.
Okay, wonderful. So thanks again, guys, for joining us. We can go to the next slide. Again, my name is Danielle Bearden. I am the Director of Human Resources for Lever One. We are a fully accredited PEO or professional employer organization situated in the River Market, and we service clients and their staff members nationwide. And so we oversee the Human Resources Initiative, and we always love to be a part of speaking events like this one. Because really it's all about bringing the humility back into human resources. We saw that reward through the pandemic when that started over a year ago, and we're still seeing that reward. People are people, and people need connections, and we're seeing just how important that is in the workplace. So when we look about a leader and a vulnerable leader, there's really compelling evidence that leaders who are prepared to show their vulnerability more easily gain that trust of others and are really, truly, in fact, more effective. So the more surveys and studies that I have found just continue to have that message be more profound. What that means is being able to admit our mistakes as a leader, to seek help if we don't know the answer, apologize, maybe acknowledging that we don't have the answers, but we're committed to finding them. And all of these involve expressions of vulnerability. And if you've attended the past two sessions with me, you'll understand why this is last, because we have to start with relationship building to gain trust. And you're not going to have leaders respect and follow you if you don't have trust. And then you're not going to have that employee retention, the productivity, all things that really push everyone to the forefront of the success of the business. So that's why this is last. Leaders have that intricate focus on them to lead with a level of vulnerability that connects the staff member to the leader in such a way that they will follow, and they will follow respectfully and with all trust. When we're looking at defining vulnerability, dictionary definitions of vulnerability focus sometimes on weakness, right? So when we think of someone as being vulnerable, very often it's known as, or I've seen people refer to this as maybe powerless or passive or feeble, yet the synonyms of openness, receptivity, sensitivity are rarely referenced. So it's common in our cultural meaning, making to equate vulnerability, whether physical or emotional, with something shameful, right? A weakness may be to be kept hidden or evaded or counteracted maybe through some site of destructiveness. But what we need to learn today is that vulnerability truly is not a weakness. And that is what I'm talking about when I say today's session will take an open mind on how we view vulnerability. When we want to become aware, vulnerability is the core, it's the heart, it's the center of meaningful human experiences. And I have mentioned before in prior presentations that I love to listen to an author who is also PhD in LMSW by the name of Brene Brown. And I welcome you all to research her as well. But she talks about vulnerability in leadership and how it has become so greatly important. But it's also piggybacks the emotional health side and being able to recognize the benefits of that. And so, but we also know that the more emotionally healthy we are, the more these protective coatings, so to speak, fall away. So the more we're open to listening to our staff members' concerns and being able to recognize when they're ready to speak of them and when they're ready not to, such as we talked about in the prior two sessions. And just therefore becoming more vulnerable, recognizing these protective coatings we may have and being able to overcome them. So vulnerability, and I think I have a slide on this as we go through, sounds like truth, feels like truth and courage, but truth and courage aren't always comfortable, right? And so they're never ever a weakness. It's what's uncomfortable. So some coping strategies that we recognize, or we try to recognize in ourselves when we're faced with those uncomfortable positions, like of risk and emotional exposure, to ask ourselves, am I going to step in and take control in this situation? Right? No one can control or harm me. I am simply going to blend in and go along no matter what I really think or feel or do. Become aware of what you're going to do as a leader in those uncomfortable positions. Or are you going to say, I don't care what I do to get results. I need to be admired. I need to be seen as I'm achieving. I'm the boss. I'm authoritative. These types of views are slowly going by the wayside. So these are some strategies that we want to try to become aware of within ourselves. What are we thinking when we are faced in these uncomfortable situations? And lastly, do we as leaders tend to think, I have to get out of here, right? This is too painful. There has to be something better I can do. I'm going to resign from this position. I can't be a leader. All important things to certainly keep in mind when we're looking at becoming aware. When we talk about those simple techniques, we really recognize what's driving and motivating. And the first technique that we're going to look at through ourselves in the position statement of why you do what you do, right? You're going to have an intent. Why are you a leader? Why do you do what you do every single day? Vulnerability means being able to spill some of your secrets or understanding that you can't go it alone. So to create an intent for how you would prefer to be in any moment. So for example, if your typical initial reaction is to take control of a situation, You might want to choose remaining calm or stepping back. Or what I say, practice the pause. For example, if a staff member approaches you and they're super upset and they just are super emotional, or maybe their behavior is just not on a professional stance, and you know that your initial reaction is going to be, we're not going to accept this in the workplace, you need to clock out and go home. Maybe try another approach of, I'm going to practice the pause. They're in my office, so they're away from everyone else out in the workplace. I'm going to accept what is as my intent, and I'm going to recognize that this reaction to preempt might happen by choosing an intent beforehand, if that makes sense. So this is meaning we are shedding, like I was saying, our protective coding, what we would normally do. So the vulnerability in leadership is being able to drop that authoritative coding and say, I'm going to practice the pause. I'm going to actively listen to you. But then also, I'm going to empathize. I'm going to handle this a little differently. And every situation is so very different. Of course, there are circumstances which would require, very different approaches as a manager. But being, of course, being able to recognize those is the most important first step. But truly becoming aware is how you're going to first take those techniques. And maybe to change your languages. When we have reactions, to first be judgmental or critical. If you as a leader find yourself about to say something like, yes, but, or yeah, that's a great idea, but remember, our policy is this. One simple change could be one of the exercises you can quickly adopt to start thinking of being more vulnerable in leadership. And that is replacing the word but with and. So I recommend this exercise a lot with leaders because it's one of the more immediate things we can do when we're looking at adopting this mindset of being vulnerable in leadership. I like to say, but is kind of the word that erases everything we've just said. Like you could say, your achievements have been so great. I am so absolutely proud that you've met this goal in the time frame that I've given. But even me, when I hear the word but, I'm like, okay, that totally erased everything positive you just said, meaning you don't really care about any of that, any of the positivity that was just done. See how much easier it is to keep others engaged when you replace the word but with and. Similarly, if you're saying, let me tell you, you can change that to, I have something I'd like to share. And when we look at replacing the word but with and, that's a great idea. And let's keep in mind how we can use that to our benefit for the company, right? So quick exercise that you can easily adopt when we're talking about this subject here. Common situations in which you can find it easy to interrupt and not let someone finish their sentence, right? We already have that preconceived thought in our head of what they're getting ready to say. The staff member, you might say, okay, this employee is tardy and late all the time and they have huge punctuality problems. I already know what they're going to say and I'm ready for it. I'm ready to speak my piece back, right? But that, again, is our protective coding. If we already know the answer, then we need to help them really see what is happening or how we're feeling. We need to shed that protective coding. We're already looking at, oh, I know they're going to say this and here's what I'm going to say back. It's not about that. Being a leader, again, is about being able to recognize those situations so you can apply principles of truly listening, because these employees want to be heard. And if they're not heard, you're not going to have their buy-in to follow you as a leader. Now, some staff members you will never get, right? Some staff members, it just won't work. We're talking about these staff members that we really feel that it will work. Listening without knowing. This is, again, what I was saying. Oftentimes, even I'm guilty of it. I think that I already know what that person's getting ready to say, but we're very wrong. Or maybe listening without judging, suspending our own opinion and broadening our perspectives. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the term perceptions are other people's reality. My perception is my reality, just like your perception is your reality. And if we know that to be true, how can we as leaders tap into that to understand, okay, that might be your reality, although that wasn't my intent, right? Listening without interrupting is another big one. Make a point to deliberately let the person finish what they have to say before we even add to the conversation. Using any or all of these techniques really open the opportunity to learn and grow. And this is all a part of piggybacking on when we notice emotional intelligence in the workplace and expanding that in ourselves, but then also knowing how to communicate with one another. Okay, now we have all that down. Now we're going to really dig into adopting some vulnerabilities there. For those of you who may have the feeling of being overwhelmed and wanting to escape, it's going to be super difficult to stay focused. So my best recommendation for these are just to kind of take a deep breath. And I know I've said it a lot, practice the pause. That's kind of my most current mantra, but it does really work. We as leaders need to kind of just take a deep breath, right? It sounds super simple to say, but reconnect. Maybe put your hands on your knees and press lightly for 30 seconds, just to bring you aware to the here and now, becoming more grounded. Maybe putting your hand over your heart, while we're sitting in judgment or in fear, to reconnect us with the people. When we want to escape, how can we as leaders overcome? And so some of those techniques are really, really constructive responses to allow us to battle those protective coatings. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Brene Brown is a research professor whom you can find more of this information. She does lots of different speaking events and I believe podcasts. And she has a book called Dare to Lead. And it's wonderful and it really studies on courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy as a leader. And so she spent decades studying that and writing about it. And I believe the next slide might be a video of her speaking. So yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
I'm going to talk about something. I'm going to talk about vulnerability today, but I'm going to talk about an aspect of it that I have not spent a lot of time talking about, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about and researching. And I want to start with two questions that I really want you to think about. And the two questions are, what should I be afraid of today? And who's to blame? What should scare me, and whose fault is it? To me, these are the most profoundly dangerous questions that we center our lives around. And what they are indicators, to me, what they're indicators of is a culture of scarcity, a culture of not enough. And when you think about any milieu in your life, think about education. What are we supposed to be afraid of, and who's to blame? Politics, the economy, social issues. I guarantee you, if you turn on the news or opened a paper today, the focus would be, here's why you should be afraid, and here's whose fault it is. And what's interesting to me about that is it's not just at a cultural level or a community level. That stuff happens in my house every week. Every week with my husband, I talk to him about what should be, why we should be fearful and whose fault it is. Mostly it's his. But you know, if something doesn't go well at my daughter's school, then I'm like, oh my God, this is going to have huge implications for our university. And we should be terrified right now that she's not getting cursive. I know she's 4, but this is still relevant. And so when those questions become the center of conversation in our communities, in our homes, in our schools, in our offices. How many of you have ever worked in an office where the central question is, what should I be afraid of today and whose fault is it? I mean, if you've ever worked, you should have your hand up. It's indicative of scarcity. So let's talk about what scarcity culture is and what it looks like. Scarcity culture, I think, is best understood with a simple question of never enough. And you can fill in the blanks. Never good enough, safe enough, certain enough, perfect enough, relevant enough, and perhaps I think one of the most dangerous and insidious messages today is never extraordinary enough. Somehow, in the world we live in today, an ordinary life has become synonymous with a meaningless life. And it has huge, and I've watched it happen not only as a researcher, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I sit across from people and look in their eyes and I have a good sense of what's going on in their lives. But as a university professor who's been teaching for the last 17 years, it's been very clear to me that extraordinary means relevant. You know, a couple of years ago, this is a terrible example, but the truth, a couple of years ago, it was huge controversy in the US because Rutgers University paid the highest honorarium it had ever paid in the history of the university to Snooki, the reality TV star of the Jersey Shore. This filters into our DNA and becomes messaging for us. And so scarcity is about never, and you know, and the top one is the big one for all of us personally, never good enough. You know, which is shame, which we all have on occasion, that sense that we're not smart enough, good enough, perfect enough, loved enough, promoted enough, we're not enough. So what we do in response to scarcity culture, I think all of us every day, is this. We wake up in the morning and we armor up. And we put it on and we say, I'm gonna go out in the world, I'm basically just gonna kick some ass, I'm not gonna let anyone see who I am, and in doing so, I can protect myself against the things that hurt the most: judgment, criticism, fear, blame, ridicule. I'm gonna armor up and I'm gonna be safe. And we rationalize and we convince ourselves that this armor is really smart. And we use a lot of different things to armor too. Perfectionism, intellectualizing. I mean, truly, I have to be honest with you, before the TED Talk, which accidentally went viral, and was a total experiment, I thought, let me be vulnerable while I'm talking about vulnerability. It's a small group. How bad could it be if a few hundred people think I'm nuts? But before that talk, do you know what the name of my lecture that I gave all the time, all over? The name, Variables Mitigating Self-Conscious Affect. It never went viral. But that was my university-issued armor. You know, if all else fails, use words that are really big, that you're quasi-sure what they mean. You know, so we use a lot of different things to armor, right? But if you get really, really clear about what we're doing every morning when we wake up and decide to armor, it's this simple. This is what we're protecting. We're protecting being hurt for a very simple reason that no one really wants to talk about, which is this: love, belonging, irreducible needs of men, women, and children. In the absence of love and belonging, there is always suffering. And so what we believe is that we can protect our sense of being lovable and being acceptable and being worth connection with armor. Here's the very worst news from my research. the news that above all other I did not want to hear is simply this. And I don't even want to say it to you because I think it's mean to say it. But it's so true. And it's simply our capacity for wholeheartedness can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted, which is a terrible thing, but a truthful thing. That we can only love and be loved as much as we are willing to have our heart broken. And so when we move through the world like this, and with our partners, with our children, with our friends, in classrooms, with the people who work for us, with the people we work for, there are tremendous casualties. You know, I shared this. This is one of the most interesting things. I did a lecture in Miami, Florida about a year ago, and it was being translated through American Sign Language. So there were two people signing as I spoke. And they came up to me before the talk, and they said, are there any words that you're going to use a lot that we may need to know about, because anything that's weird or clinical? And I said, well, vulnerability is a word I'm going to use a lot. And they kind of looked at each other and I said, well, we have a sign for vulnerability. It's this. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, it means weak in the knees. And I was like, oh God, that's not the sign. And they kind of talked for a second. They said, well, there's only one other sign for vulnerability, and it's kind of weird. And I said, well, what is it? And she said, it's this. I said, that would be the one I'm talking about. And so rather than walking through the world like this, most of us do this. And in fact, I think the troublesome thing about doing this is that it doesn't really safeguard us from pain, but it does prevent us from accessing the things that vulnerability takes us to. Vulnerability is the path to love, belonging, joy, intimacy, trust, innovation, and creativity. You know, think about this for a second. 85% of the men and women we've interviewed, 13,000 pieces of data, 85% can recall a time in school that was so shaming, it forever changed how they thought of themselves as learners. 50% of those stories involved art and creativity. Now today I get asked to go into corporations, organizations, and the number one problem is there's no innovation. We don't understand what's happening. Without vulnerability, there can be no creativity. There can be no innovation. Without failure, which is maybe the ultimate experience of vulnerability, which can't happen when you're locked down like this, there can never be innovation. But I would argue one of the greatest casualties of invulnerability is this: empathy. Let me ask a question, a little audience participation. You share something very vulnerable with someone, and when you look at them, what you know is they deeply understand what you're talking about, and they get it, and they're really right there with you in it. How does that feel? Amazing. Thumbs up. Awesome. Supportive. What else? Say again? Intimate. Loving. Connected. Say again? Reassuring. Safe. Relief. You share something incredibly vulnerable with someone, and they don't get it at all, and they're just standing across from you. How does that feel? Shame. We've got the choir right here. Shame. Okay. Shame. What else? I'm sorry? Lost. Annoying. Rejected. Terror. Isolating. Okay, so from shame, terror, isolating, disconnection. These are not good experiences. And interestingly, guess what those experiences drive? Scarcity. And so scarcity seduces us into locking up our hearts and then keeps them locked by making sure that there's very little empathy in the world. So let's talk about some of the big blocks to empathy that are born out of a lack of vulnerability. I loved this photo because it's armor, but it's a close-up of armor. Sympathy. So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? How many of you think about empathy and sympathy as very different things? A few people. Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. I'll tell you why. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar, actually from the UK, who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. 4 things that empathy always had in common. They were perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth, staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do, recognizing emotion in other people, and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. So if Tim called, Tim, I'm going to use you as an example. Is that okay? Go ahead. Tim called and said, I just finished my rewrites on this article. I'm trying to think of something we have in common, which is writing. I just finished my rewrites on this article, and they've sent it back again, and I just have this overwhelming feeling that nothing's going to please these folks. So to respond empathically or empathetically, you can say it either way, I would need to try to understand his perspective, stay out of judgment, recognize what he's feeling, and kind of communicate it back. Now, when you're teaching graduate students who are new to counseling, they like to go, oh, Tim, you must be feeling so sad. I feel that with you, which is not exactly what empathy looks like, painfully sometimes maybe. But if he said that to me and I went, oh, shit, I hate that, would you know? I've been there. I hate that. Or if I looked at him and said, or talked on the phone even and said, oh God, there's nothing worse than just keep on sending it in and sending it in. That's empathy. Empathy is, I'm feeling with you. Sympathy, I'm feeling for you. How would it feel, Tim, if I said, oh, you poor thing? How does that feel for y'all? Okay, so someone just went like this. Like, keep it. So sympathy is about feeling for, empathy is feeling with. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is dark, deep hole. Ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is, I see ya, it's bad, but stuff like that didn't happen to people like me. In Texas, did someone, who said yay? Are there Texans here? Houstonian. Y'all were my favorite right from the beginning. I knew there was something, empathically. In Texas, in the South in general, in the US, we have the worst saying ever that just smacks and reeks of sympathy, which is if Tim called and said, I keep sending it in and they keep pushing it back. And I looked at you and said, bless your heart. How does that feel? It makes you pretty mad. Because basically what I'm saying is that sucks, but too bad, and God is on my side. I've decided I can make $1 million in Texas by simply selling a t-shirt that says, if you bless my heart, I'll punch your face. So empathy is you can't, with a locked up heart, with invulnerability, you cannot be empathic, because when you call me, empathy is not the default. Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. And when you called, man, I was just unloading the dishwasher, minding my own business in my happy place. And now I have to connect with the fact that, truthfully, I could wallpaper this room with rejection and revision letters. And I have to touch base with that place in order to be empathic back. So sympathy is one of the things that really gets in the way of empathy. And sympathy is also often how we respond when we don't want to be vulnerable to someone else's struggle. Does that make sense? The next one, I'm going to get hot talking about it. I just know I'm going to go into a little shame, but then I'll pop right out. Nothing will, if you're on the first row, you're safe. Blame. How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? I'm like, hi, my name is Brene. I am a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house, I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm getting ready to go teach, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: damn you, Steve. Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends, and the night before he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back like at 10:30, chatting it up with his friends. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed at 10. Therefore, okay, and let me just ask, because I'm going to assume that you're laughing with me, not at me. How many women in here are thinking, that makes absolute sense? And how many men in here are thinking, oh, that's how it works?
Okay,
Right.
Michelle, can you stop this
I'm cleaning up.
video? Awesome, thank you. And so really, I think as we pick up on Brene Brown's way of thinking, we're picking up on what we mean by vulnerability. Dropping that armor, getting back to empathy, getting back to being able to be collaborative with our staff. So you can go on to the next slide, Michelle. Any questions so far in the chat? I guess I haven't seen any.
I haven't seen any, Danielle.
Okay, so we'll just continue to go on. I like this quote, and it's by Brene Brown. Who we are is how we lead. So be able to be self-aware, have that self-awareness of how we lead, how we act as a person in the workspace is going to be how we lead. There is a Dare to Lead assessment. If anyone's interested, you can follow the link on the screen. And it talks about the 4 skill sets that are teachable, observable, and measurable. And again, just helping you gauge where your strengths are on the leadership assessment, which I think is really pretty cool. So to recap, I just want to kind of run through this, what vulnerable leaders do, just to kind of bring this full circle to you guys. Vulnerable leaders accept vulnerability as a strength. We talked at the start of this, how a lot of times it's viewed as a weakness, it's a strength. Being vulnerable isn't a bad thing, and it doesn't make you weak. And so the more we can adopt that mindset, it actually makes you a better leader, because you stop wasting energy protecting yourself from what you think other people shouldn't see. And it allows you to start being your authentic self, right? And Michelle, you can go to the next slide.
Danielle, there is a comment in the chat wanting to get that link again.
Yeah.
Can you get back to that slide?
Yeah, Michelle, can you go back to that slide? daretolead.brenebrown.com/assessment. // Okay, awesome. So vulnerable leaders also admit their own mistakes. We all make mistakes, especially as leaders. The more willing we are to admit our own and not make excuses or point fingers, the more the more our staff are going to trust us, and they're going to want to follow our lead. So take responsibility, apologize when we make a mistake, and use that as an opportunity to learn together. But vulnerable leaders also share their fears and they share their insecurities. Fear and insecurity are inseparable from being human and being a leader. We all get scared, right? But too often we want to deny it, we want to avoid it, we want to seem like we are the untouchable, but we're not. This is what vulnerability in leadership means. Being able to share our fears with others is not something we do to make excuses or to dump our stuff on people. It's a bold act of that vulnerable leadership and something that we can have that profound impact on those around us. I'm actually afraid of this, but here's how I'm going to cope. And so those connections are formed when we're open about our experiences. Don't take yourself too seriously either, right? It's important for us to have that sense of humor. Don't get too full of ourselves as a leader. Sometimes that happens too. And it's something many of us might do. You know, do you have any idea of how important you think I am? Like, we have to laugh at that because don't get too serious. We as leaders can have some fun too. And share your own process, your own journey, challenges, take off that armor as we talked about. We're always going through a process of growth and discovery and challenges as life, especially as leaders. You know, it doesn't have to be that difficult or painful, even though sometimes it is. The more transparent we are about our own process, the more willing we are able to let people around us know what we're dealing with, and then we're going to further gain their trust. And don't be afraid to ask for help and receive that help from others as well. You know, as leaders, most of us like to help others, but often we have a difficult time asking for help ourselves. And asking for help sometimes can be perceived, and maybe even by us, it's our own detriment, as an admission of weakness, right? And all of us need help and support, and that should be the message we're sending to our staff. So for example, in 2007, Starbucks provided a significant leadership lesson. The business had experienced the worst decline in company history, and he emotionally shared this with all of his employees. And he said that if the company doesn't change, Starbucks as a company will be no more. And as a result, his openness and transparency and allowing himself to be vulnerable to connect with his employees resulted in Starbucks' recovery and cemented their status as one of the best brands in the world. So creating that vulnerability mind shift, starting to see the aspirations of the business through the eyes of the people you lead. It's a new mindset. Continually check your ego at the door, right? Checking that. And most CEOs operate in a kind of echo chamber in which the executive team panders to the boss and such, but invariably this results in leaders way overestimating their performance and capabilities and leading maybe to inflated projections or value destruction, or just be able to have that vulnerability mind shift with our ego here and embrace a new mindset. And that's exactly what I just talked about, Michelle, so you can go to the next slide. When people share, great business does too, and these are the positive benefits of vulnerable leaders. You know, there are many reasons to believe that vulnerability can be an asset for leaders, but why? You know, vulnerable leaders inspire. They're more authentic. They build bonds that lead to increase. That's as simply stated as we could get. Vulnerability, just in closing thoughts, decreases tension, stress at work. It increases flow of ideas, creativity, innovations, allows for building those greater bonds and increasing that emotional intelligence. And then emotional connections leads to less turnover. You know, now more than ever, if there's anything I can end in saying, the world needs leaders who are vulnerable, empathetic, compassionate servant leaders who put the interests of others in the world first. And now more than ever, we need that. So when I talk about vulnerability and leadership, I hope you've gathered this isn't something that one exercise is gonna do it. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of adopting. It's time for a change. It's time to bring the humility back. And these are some exercises we tend to talk about in our efforts in doing so. So in ending, any questions, concerns about kind of what we talked about today, and everyone have that link that you can certainly use to take that assessment?
Danielle, I don't see any questions, but as we kind of close things out, certainly feel free to pop that into the chat if you do have a question. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and Danielle and Michelle, thank you so much for all of your hard work with these leadership sessions that we've been hosting. As I mentioned, we will be posting the recording from today's session on our YouTube channel. And I did share the link in the chat, but you can always Google search Kansas City Women's Business Center YouTube channel to find it as well. So we will have this recording available for you to access at any time. And I still don't see any questions, so I think we will go ahead and conclude today's session. Thank you so much and have a great day.